At my retirement party, my grandson slipped something in my wine, so I switched glasses. They say retirement parties are supposed to be celebrations, but mine felt more like a funeral where the guest of honor was still breathing. I stood at the head table of the Riverside Banquet Hall, watching my so-called loved ones mingle beneath those gaudy crystal chandeliers my wife Margaret had insisted on for our 40th wedding anniversary 3 years ago. The same hall where we'd celebrated promotions, graduations, and christenings. Tonight, it was supposed to mark the end of my 42-year career as a civil engineer, but something in the air tasted wrong. Maybe it was the way my daughter Susan kept checking her phone every 30 seconds, or how my son Michael had cornered my financial advisor near the shrimp cocktail table. Could have been the forced laughter echoing off the burgundy wallpaper, or the fact that half the people here hadn't spoken to me in months until they heard about tonight's party. At 65, you develop a sixth sense about people. You learn to read the spaces between words, the pauses before answers, the way someone's smile doesn't quite reach their eyes. Tonight, that sense was screaming, "Grandpa Joe!" My youngest granddaughter Emma bounced over, her pigtails flying. At 8 years old, she was the only person in this room whose affection I never questioned. "Mom says you're gonna travel the world now." "Maybe, sweetheart," I said, ruffling her hair. "Where should I go first?" "Disney World!" She giggled, and for a moment the knot in my chest loosened. But then I saw him approaching, my eldest grandson Tyler. 24 years old, fresh out of business school, and carrying himself like he owned the place. His father's son through and through, with that same calculating look Michael had perfected by age 12. "Hey, Grandpa," Tyler said, flashing that $1,000,000 smile he'd inherited from his mother. "Great turnout tonight." I nodded, watching him survey the room like a general assessing his troops. Tyler had always been ambitious, the kind of kid who'd sell his sister's Halloween candy to buy stocks if he could. Smart as a whip, but restless in a way that made me uneasy. "Listen," he said, stepping closer. "I wanted to talk to you about something important. Maybe we could grab coffee next week?" "Sure," I replied, though every instinct told me this conversation wouldn't be about career advice. The evening dragged on. My former colleagues shared war stories about bridge projects and municipal politics. My neighbor Harold cornered me for 20 minutes about his gutter problems. My sister-in-law Dorothy complained about her arthritis while eyeing the open bar. But I kept watching my family. Susan whispered urgently to her husband by the restroom entrance. Michael's jaw was tight as he spoke to Tyler near the bar. My youngest son David looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot whenever anyone mentioned my future plans. They were all waiting for something. At 9:30, Tyler appeared at my elbow with 2 glasses of wine. "Time for the toast, Grandpa," he said, handing me a glass of deep red Cabernet. "I thought maybe I could say a few words." I accepted the wine, noting how Tyler's fingers lingered on the stem of his own glass. How he held it just a little too carefully, like it contained something precious. "That's thoughtful of you," I said. Tyler moved to the center of the room, tapping his fork against his glass. The chatter died down. "Everyone, if I could have your attention," he called out, his voice carrying that confident tone that had charmed teachers and professors for years. "I'd like to propose a toast to my grandfather, Joe Mitchell." Glasses raised around the room. I lifted mine, watching Tyler over the rim. "Grandpa Joe taught me that success isn't just about what you build," Tyler continued, his eyes finding mine across the crowd. "It's about the legacy you leave behind." Something flickered in his expression. Was it guilt? Determination? I couldn't tell. "To a man who built half the bridges in this county," Tyler said, raising his glass higher. "And to the family who'll carry on his legacy." The crowd murmured approval. "Cheers!" they called out. But as I started to lift the glass to my lips, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The surface of the wine caught the chandelier light, and for just a fraction of a second, I saw it, the faintest shimmer, like oil on water. A ripple that shouldn't have been there. In that instant, 42 years of engineering precision kicked in. When something doesn't look right, you don't ignore it. You investigate. I glanced at Tyler, who was watching me with an intensity that didn't match his casual smile. His own glass remained untouched in his hand. Time slowed. The room filled with the sound of people drinking, laughing, celebrating. But I wasn't focused on them anymore. I was thinking about that shimmer, about Tyler's careful handling of my glass, about the way my family had been acting all evening. Without breaking eye contact with my grandson, I smoothly reached over and switched our glasses while everyone was distracted by Dorothy's loud commentary about the wine selection. Tyler's eyes widened slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Cheers, Grandpa," he said, raising what used to be my glass. "Cheers," I replied, lifting what used to be his. We drank. And that's when everything went to hell. Tyler took a long sip of wine, smiled at me one last time, and then his face changed. It started with confusion. His eyebrows pulled together like he was trying to solve a math problem. Then his hand went to his throat, and the wine glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. "Tyler?" Susan called out from across the room, her voice sharp with maternal concern. But Tyler couldn't answer. His face was turning pale, then gray, then something close to blue around the lips. He clawed at his collar, gasping for air that wouldn't come. His eyes bulged, darting around the room like a trapped animal's. And then he collapsed. The sound of his body hitting the floor cut through the party chatter like a gunshot. For one terrible moment, the entire banquet hall went silent except for the soft jazz music still playing from the speakers. Then all hell broke loose. "Oh my God!" Dorothy shrieked, dropping her purse. "Someone call 911! Tyler!" Michael pushed through the crowd, his face white as paper. "Tyler, can you hear me?" My grandson writhed on the floor, his body convulsing, foam bubbling at the corners of his mouth. His dress shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands clawed uselessly at the air. "Give him space!" Harold shouted, though he was pushing forward with everyone else to get a better look. Susan dropped to her knees beside her son, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. 911? We need an ambulance at Riverside Banquet Hall. My son, I don't know what's happening. The chaos swirled around me, but I stood perfectly still, watching. Time had slowed to a crawl, giving me a chance to study every face in that room. Michael knelt beside Tyler, loosening his son's tie while tears streamed down his face. But there was something else in his expression, a flicker of panic that went beyond a father's natural fear. The kind of panic that comes when a plan goes horribly wrong. Susan was pure maternal terror, nothing calculated about her reaction. She cradled Tyler's head, whispering prayers and promises. Whatever was happening, she hadn't known it was coming. David hung back near the wall, his face green with nausea. My youngest son had always been squeamish about medical emergencies, but tonight he looked like he might collapse himself. My sister-in-law Dorothy stood frozen with her hands over her mouth. The financial advisor was already heading for the exit. Most of my former colleagues clustered near the bar, unsure whether to help or stay out of the way. But there were other reactions too. Subtle ones. Tyler's girlfriend Jennifer stood by the dessert table, her phone already recording. Smart girl, either documenting evidence or creating an alibi. My neighbor Harold had positioned himself near the kitchen exit. Interesting choice for someone who claimed Tyler was like a grandson to him. And then there was my family's reactions to each other. Susan kept looking at Michael with confusion, as if she expected him to know what was happening. Michael wouldn't meet anyone's eyes except Tyler's. David had moved closer to the door, his lawyer instincts probably kicking in. "Where's that ambulance?" Susan screamed into her phone. Tyler's convulsions were slowing, which could mean the worst was over or that something much worse was beginning. His breathing came in short, desperate gasps. I knelt down beside him, placing my hand on his forehead. To everyone else, it looked like a grandfather's love. But I leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Who told you to do it?" His eyes found mine, wide with terror and something that might have been regret. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "The paramedics are 5 minutes out," someone called from across the room. Michael grabbed my arm. Dad, what did you say to him? Just telling him to hold on, I replied, studying my son's face. The panic was still there, mixed with something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. Tyler's hand suddenly gripped my wrist with surprising strength. He was trying to tell me something, his mouth forming words that wouldn't come. I saw him mouth what looked like sorry, and then something else. A name, maybe? But then his grip loosened, and his eyes rolled back. He's losing consciousness, Susan cried. The next few minutes blurred together, sirens wailing outside, paramedics rushing in with equipment, Tyler being lifted onto a gurney while machines beeped and monitors flashed. The professionals took over with the kind of efficient calm that comes from seeing the worst of human nature on a regular basis. As they wheeled him out, I caught one of the paramedics talking quietly to his partner. Looks like poisoning. We'll know more at the hospital. The word poisoning rippled through the remaining guests like a stone thrown into still water. Suddenly everyone was looking at everyone else with suspicion. Michael followed the ambulance to the hospital with Susan. David muttered something about calling his lawyer. The party guests filed out in uncomfortable silence, leaving me alone with the broken glass and the terrible knowledge of what had almost happened. But as I stood in that empty banquet hall, one question echoed in my mind. Tyler was just a kid playing with fire. Someone older, someone smarter, had put him up to this. The real question was, who? The drive home from the hospital took me past the construction site where I'd built my first bridge 38 years ago. Funny how life brings you full circle when you least expect it. Tyler was stable but unconscious, hooked up to more machines than a NASA launch pad. The doctors had confirmed what I already knew, poison. They were running tests to identify exactly what kind, but I had a pretty good idea. Something fast-acting but not immediately lethal. Someone wanted me gone, but they weren't quite ready to be murderers. Yet. Sitting in my empty kitchen at midnight, I poured myself a real glass of wine, one I'd opened myself, and let my mind wander back to where this all started. 3 months ago, when I'd announced my retirement. The family dinner had been at Michael's house, one of those sprawling colonials in Westfield that screamed, "I've made it!" Susan had brought her famous lasagna. David had driven up from the city with his new boyfriend, Marcus. Even Tyler had shown up, though he'd spent most of dinner texting. "So, Dad," Michael had said over dessert, "have you given any thought to, well, to how you want to handle things? Your will, I mean. The estate planning stuff." The table had gone quiet. Even little Emma had stopped chattering about her dance recital. "I've given it plenty of thought," I'd said, watching their faces. "In fact, I've been working with Patterson and Associates for months now." Susan nearly choked on her tiramisu. "Months? Why didn't you tell us?" "Because it's my business," I'd replied simply. That's when the mask started slipping. Michael leaned forward, his real estate agent's smile firmly in place. "Dad, we just want to make sure everything's handled properly. You know, minimize tax implications, protect the assets." "Protect them from what?" "Well, you know how these things can get complicated. Probate, estate taxes, family disputes." David had jumped in then, his lawyer brain spinning into overdrive. "Dad's right to be careful. But Michael has a point about tax planning. The estate's substantial enough that—" "Substantial enough?" I'd interrupted. "You've been doing research on my finances?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't just been researching. They'd been planning. Over the next few weeks, the calls started. Michael would drop by to check on me, and somehow steer every conversation toward my retirement plans. Susan would bring Emma over for visits and casually mention how expensive little Emma's private school was becoming. David was more direct. "Dad, you know I love you, but you're not getting any younger. Maybe it's time to think about distributing some assets while you're still around to see us enjoy them." But it was Tyler who really opened my eyes. I'd caught him in my home office 6 weeks ago, going through the files on my desk. When I asked what he was doing, he'd spun some story about looking for old family photos for a school project. The next week, I'd gotten a call from my financial advisor. Someone had been asking questions about my accounts, using information only a family member could know. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life tonight. I'd called Patterson and Associates and made some changes. Big ones. The original will had split everything 3 ways between my children, with substantial trusts set up for the grandchildren. Tyler, as the oldest grandson and the one I'd always thought had the most potential, was set to receive the largest share, nearly $500,000 when he turned 25. But Tyler had been making some questionable choices lately. The gambling debts he thought I didn't know about. The credit cards he maxed out. The investment opportunity, that turned out to be a cryptocurrency scam that cost him $15,000. So I'd quietly removed him from the trust entirely. The new will was different. More conditional. More focused on character than bloodline. But here's what really ate at me as I sat in my kitchen, staring at that glass of wine. Tyler wasn't smart enough to plan something like tonight on his own. He was impulsive, greedy, and desperate, but he wasn't calculating. Someone had to have put the idea in his head. Someone who knew about the changes to the will. Someone who understood that if I died tonight, before I could make any public announcements about my estate planning, the old will would still be in effect. Someone who stood to lose everything if I lived long enough to reveal my new plans. I thought about Michael's panic when Tyler collapsed. Not just fatherly concern, the specific terror of watching a plan fall apart in real time. I thought about Susan's confusion, her genuine surprise. She might be greedy, but she wasn't a killer. At least, I didn't think she was. David's lawyer instincts had kicked in too fast. He was already thinking about legal implications while his nephew was dying on the floor. But there was someone else. Someone who'd been at the party tonight but had faded into the background when things went wrong. Someone with access to Tyler, the knowledge to guide him, and the most to lose if my new will became public. As I sat there in the dark, pieces of a bigger puzzle started falling into place. The poisoning wasn't Tyler's desperate gamble. It was someone else's chess move. And Tyler was just a pawn they were willing to sacrifice. The hospital waiting room at St. Mary's had that particular smell of disinfectant and despair that I'd come to know too well over the years. Margaret had spent her final weeks in a room just down this same hallway. By morning, word had spread through our small town like wildfire. Food poisoning at Joe Mitchell's retirement party. Per Tyler in intensive care. Such a shame, people whispered, shaking their heads over their coffee and morning newspapers. But whispers have a way of evolving. I heard it might not have been the food, Dorothy murmured to her bridge club friends near the vending machines. My Harold thinks something was wrong with the wine. Wine doesn't just turn poisonous, replied Mrs. Henderson from down the street. Unless someone made it that way. The word poisoning was starting to stick. Detective Sarah Chin arrived around noon, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd handled the investigation when the Riverside Country Club had that embezzlement scandal last year. She spoke quietly with the doctors first, then asked to meet with family members separately. I was the last one she interviewed. Mr. Mitchell, she said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair beside me. I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you about last night. I played the part perfectly. Shocked grandfather, devastated by the accident, completely mystified by what could have happened. Tyler's always been such a healthy boy, I said, letting my voice shake just a little. I can't imagine what could have caused this. The preliminary toxicology report shows traces of oleander extract in his system, Detective Chin said, watching my reaction carefully. That's not something you accidentally ingest. I frowned, as if trying to process this information. Oleander? The plant? Highly toxic if prepared correctly. Someone would need specific knowledge to extract it safely. She paused. Do you know anyone in your family with botanical experience? Gardening knowledge? My mind immediately went to Susan, who'd won 3 county fair blue ribbons for her flower arrangements. But I kept that to myself. I really couldn't say, Detective. This is also shocking. She nodded and moved on to questions about the party, the guest list, who had access to the drinks. I answered everything with the bewildered honesty of a man who'd nearly been murdered by his own grandson. But while I was playing the confused victim for Detective Chin, I was conducting my own investigation. Michael had barely left Tyler's bedside, which looked touching until you realized he was positioning himself as the grieving father, deflecting any suspicion. But I'd seen him on his phone in the hallway, having heated conversations with someone he kept calling Patterson. Not my estate attorney Patterson, I'd already checked. Michael was talking to someone else entirely. Susan had thrown herself into the role of supportive sister, bringing coffee and sandwiches for everyone. The perfect picture of family unity. But she'd also spent considerable time questioning the nurses about Tyler's condition, trying to determine exactly how much he might remember when he woke up. David had returned to the city that morning, claiming he had important cases that couldn't wait. But his boyfriend Marcus had let slip that David had been making phone calls about damage control and legal exposure. Each of my children was hiding something. The question was, which one was hiding attempted murder? Over the next 3 days, as Tyler remained unconscious, I started piecing together the real picture of my family's finances. Michael's real estate empire wasn't as solid as it appeared. I'd made some discreet calls to colleagues in the industry and learned he'd been leveraging properties against each other in an increasingly desperate shell game. His cash flow had dried up 6 months ago. He needed a significant injection of capital, exactly the amount he stood to inherit, or he'd lose everything by Christmas. Susan's perfect suburban life was built on credit cards and home equity loans. Her husband's job at the insurance company barely covered their mortgage, let alone Emma's private school tuition and Susan's shopping habits. She'd been borrowing against their house to maintain appearances, and the bills were coming due. David's law practice was struggling too. His specialty in corporate law had dried up during the recession, and he'd been taking on debt to keep his office open. His pride wouldn't let him admit he was failing, but the financial records I'd quietly obtained told the story clearly enough. All 3 of my children were drowning in debt. All 3 had been counting on their inheritance to save them. And all 3 had reason to want me dead before I could change my will. But there was still the question of Tyler. On the 4th day, Detective Chin came back with more questions. The hospital had found something else in Tyler's system, Rohypnol, a date rape drug that could cause memory loss and compliance. Someone drugged your grandson before he was poisoned, she told me. Which suggests he may not have been acting entirely of his own free will. That's when it all clicked into place. Tyler hadn't been the mastermind. He'd been drugged, manipulated, turned into an unwitting weapon by someone who understood exactly how to exploit his desperation and his trust. Someone who'd been playing a longer game than I'd realized. As I sat by Tyler's bedside that evening, watching the machines keep him alive, I finally understood the true scope of what had been planned. The poisoning wasn't just about my death. It was about Tyler's destruction too. Tyler woke up on the 5th day. His eyes fluttered open around noon, unfocused and confused. The first word he whispered was, "Grandpa." I was alone with him when it happened. Michael had gone home to shower, Susan was in the cafeteria, and David was back in the city. Perfect timing, really. I'd been waiting for this moment. "Tyler," I said softly, leaning close to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" What happened?" His voice was barely a whisper. "The party. I remember the toast, and then. You collapsed, son. You've been unconscious for 5 days. Tears started rolling down his cheeks. "Grandpa, I did something terrible. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "I know," I said simply. His eyes widened with shock and shame. "You know? I've known for a long time that something like this might happen." I pulled my chair closer to his bed. "Tyler, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Who told you to put something in my drink?" I can't." He was struggling, probably still feeling the effects of whatever they'd given him to make him compliant. "Son, you're not in trouble. Not with me. But I need to know who manipulated you into this." The machines beeped steadily as Tyler fought to remember. Finally, he whispered a name that I'd been expecting for days. Uncle Harold. My neighbor. Margaret's brother. The man who'd been coming to family dinners for 40 years, who'd helped me fix my roof last summer, who'd been like a fourth son to me. The man who'd known every detail of my finances because I trusted him with my tax preparation for the past decade. He said. Tyler's voice grew stronger as the memories came back. He said you were going to cut everyone out of the will? That you were leaving everything to charity. He showed me documents. What kind of documents? Bank statements, investment portfolios. He said the family would lose everything because you'd gone senile and bitter. He said it was our duty to stop you before you destroyed everyone's future. I nodded, unsurprised. Harold had always been clever. Too clever. Tyler, I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible. But I want you to trust me, the way I'm trusting you right now. He nodded weakly. I've been expecting someone to try to kill me for almost 3 years. Tyler's eyes went wide. Not because I'm paranoid, I continued, but because I've been watching my family very carefully, and I could see the signs. The questions about money, the financial pressure everyone was under, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small recording device. I've been wearing this to every family gathering for 8 months. And I had 3 more placed strategically around the banquet hall last week. Tyler stared at the device like it might bite him. I have recordings of Harold approaching you 6 weeks ago, Tyler. I have recordings of him explaining how to extract oleander poison from the bushes in his backyard. I have recordings of him giving you the Rohypnol to calm your nerves before the party. You've been recording everything? Not everything. Just the important conversations. The ones that proved what I suspected all along. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where Detective Chin was probably interviewing Harold right about now. You see, Tyler, it was never about the money. It was about seeing who my family really were when they thought my back was turned. I don't understand. For the past year, I've been conducting a test. I've been leaking different information to different people about my will, my assets, my plans. False information, mostly. I wanted to see who would try to manipulate the situation. I turned back to face him. Your Uncle Harold failed spectacularly. But I was the one who almost killed you. No, son. You were the weapon he chose to use. And you know what? In the end, you made the right choice. When push came to shove, when you had that glass in your hand, you hesitated. That hesitation, that tiny moment of conscience, that's what saved both our lives. Tyler was crying again, but these were different tears. Relief, maybe. Or redemption. The new will I mentioned to Harold? It's real. But it's not what he thinks. I'm not leaving everything to charity, Tyler. I'm leaving it to the people who proved they loved me more than my money. Who? You, for starters. Because even drugged and manipulated, you couldn't go through with murder. Emma, because she's still innocent. Marcus, because he's the only one who never asked me for anything. I sat back down beside his bed. Your parents, your aunts and uncles? They're going to have to find their own way. I'm done being their safety net. What about Uncle Harold? I smiled grimly. Harold's going to have bigger problems than money. Attempted murder carries a pretty steep sentence. Tyler closed his eyes. I can't believe I trusted him. Neither could I said. Until tonight. Harold was arrested at his house that same evening. Detective Chin found oleander plants in his greenhouse and a chemistry set that would have made a college professor proud. Turns out Margaret's brother had always been more interested in botany than anyone realized. The recordings I'd made were crystal clear. Harold explaining to Tyler how desperate times called for desperate measures. Harold providing the drugs and the poison. Harold painting me as a bitter old man who was about to destroy the family's future out of spite. What Harold hadn't counted on was Tyler's conscience, or my 42 years of building things designed to last. A week later, I called a family meeting. Not at a restaurant or someone's house, but in the conference room at Patterson and Associates, my actual attorney's office. I wanted everything official, witnessed, and legally binding. Michael arrived first, his real estate smile replaced by something harder. Susan came with her husband and Emma, though I'd asked that Emma wait outside with the secretary. David drove down from the city with Marcus, both of them looking like they were attending a funeral. "Thank you all for coming," I said, settling into the chair at the head of the conference table. Patterson sat to my right, a stack of legal documents in front of him. "Dad, what's this about?" Susan asked. "If it's about Tyler, it's about all of you," I said quietly. "It's about the choices you've made and the consequences that follow." Michael leaned forward. "Look, if this is about money. It's always been about money with you, hasn't it, Michael?" I kept my voice level, matter of fact. "You've been leveraging your properties against each other for months, using your reputation as my son to secure loans you can't possibly repay." His face went pale. I turned to Susan. "And you, sweetheart? You've been borrowing against your house to pay for Emma's school and maintain a lifestyle you can't afford. Your credit cards are maxed out, and you're 3 months behind on the mortgage." Susan's hands started shaking. "David," I continued, "your law practice is failing. You've been taking on debt to keep the lights on, but you're too proud to admit it. You need money, and you need it desperately." David straightened his shoulders. "Dad, our financial situations don't. They don't justify attempted murder." "You're right about that." The room went dead silent. "Harold confessed yesterday," I said. "In detail. How he convinced Tyler that I'd gone senile and was about to leave everything to charity. How he drugged my grandson and turned him into a weapon. How he promised to split my estate with all of you if the plan succeeded." Susan gasped. "We didn't know." "No, you didn't know about the poison. But you all knew something was wrong. You all felt that your inheritance was threatened, and instead of coming to me, your father, you chose to wait and see what happened." I opened the folder in front of me. "So I'm going to tell you what's actually in my will. The real one, not the lies Harold was spreading." I looked at each of them in turn. "Michael, you get nothing. Your gambling with other people's money, your willingness to use my name to secure loans you couldn't repay, that's not the kind of legacy I want to support." Michael shot to his feet. "You can't be serious." "Susan, you get nothing either. Not because you're a bad person, but because you'd rather lie and manipulate than ask for help. Emma's college fund, however, is fully secured. She'll never want for anything." Susan burst into tears. "David, your inheritance goes into a trust that will pay your debts and give you a fresh start, but only if you agree to financial counseling and regular oversight." David nodded slowly, the lawyer in him probably calculating whether this was better than nothing. "The bulk of my estate, the house, the investments, the savings, goes to Tyler." "What?" Michael exploded. "He tried to kill you. He was manipulated by someone he trusted, drugged, and used. But when it mattered most, his conscience won. That tells me everything I need to know about his character." Michael stormed toward the door. "This is insane. We'll contest it." "You could try." Patterson spoke for the first time. "But your father has documentation of every conversation, every financial decision, every attempt at manipulation over the past year. Including recordings of Harold discussing the murder plot with each of you individually." Susan looked up through her tears. You never said yes," I agreed. "But you never said no either. You never warned me. You never called the police. You just waited to see if it would work." Michael slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. David sat quietly, probably processing the legal implications. Susan just cried. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 65 years. My retirement party was supposed to mark the end of my career, I said. Instead, it marked the end of my illusions about family. I spent 42 years building bridges that connect people, bring them together. But some gaps are too wide to span. As I walked toward the door, I paused and looked back at the children I'd raised, the family I'd provided for, the legacy I'd thought I was building. "When you slipped something into my glass," I said, "you forgot one thing. I've spent 65 years learning how to taste poison in every form. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I walked out into the sunlight, finally free.